Are you struggling to sequence a yoga class for beginners? I'm going to teach you exactly how to sequence a yoga class for beginners. If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe and bell button so you're notified every time I release a new video giving you yoga teaching tips. This is the exact method I used to teach a beginner yoga class at my brick-and-mortar yoga studio, and our beginner yoga class was one of the most popular and successful classes we had on our schedule. So before we dive in, let me know in the comments, what is your biggest challenge when it comes to sequencing a beginner yoga class? Because if I don't cover it in this video, I'll definitely respond to your comment. So before I dive into the tips, I want to first define what is beginner yoga. So beginner yoga is for people who are new to yoga and need to learn the basics and fundamentals. They really need to be taught how to do the yoga poses. So beginner yoga is not for people who have been practicing yoga for years and feel confident doing the yoga basics. Of course, people who have been practicing yoga for years might still enjoy a beginner yoga class because they like the pace and style of the class. That definitely happened at my yoga studio. We had seasoned, experienced yogis who just liked the style and the pace of the beginner yoga class. But I want you to keep the integrity of the class. So if you have a class on your schedule, you're teaching a class called Beginner Yoga, Yoga Basics, Yoga Foundations, you're not changing what you're teaching in the class based on who's showing up in your class, right? Just because I have an experienced yogi in my class who can do handstands and headstands and all the crazy poses doesn't mean I'm then going to change what I'm teaching in my class. That is really, really important when you're teaching beginners. You must be your word. Your students must know that they can trust you and they trust what it says on the schedule. So when it says you're teaching beginner yoga, no matter who shows up, you're going to teach beginner yoga within these guidelines that I'm going to provide for you. So let me know in the comments if that's making sense. I know I definitely had that experience before when the schedule said one thing and I go to the class and then the teacher totally changes it, and it makes me not want to go back because I can't trust that the class is going to be what they said the class is going to be. So don't do that. If it's beginner, no matter who shows up, you're teaching beginner. So I want to go over some of the basic distinctions that I give for sequencing to beginners. Now you can find this in my free ebook, Yoga Sequencing Made Easy. The description is, the link is in the description section of this, so I'm gonna read it out loud, but if you wanna download it, you definitely can. So one of the first distinctions when it comes to teaching beginner yoga is the poses, right? So the poses that you do in class, you need to actually teach your students how to do all of the basic and fundamental poses, right? They don't know how to do downward dog. They don't know how to do child's pose. So make sure you're not just saying the name of the pose, but actually giving them instructional cues on how to do the pose. So in beginner yoga, so let me give this caveat, right? So first off, there's a bunch of different types of beginners, but at my yoga studio, we specialize in beginner yoga for pain and stress relief. So I had a lot of beginners who were not athletic, who spent most of the day sitting in a chair, working at a desk. And so that's the beginners that I'm talking about here. Of course, there are more athletic beginners who have been very active their whole life and are already super flexible. For the purpose of this video, I'm talking about beginners who aren't very active, who spend a lot of time sitting, who do have lower back pain and physical ailments in their body. And so that's the type of beginner I'm talking about here. Just wanted to make that caveat as everybody's body is different, right? So when I'm teaching beginner, I always teach how to actually do all of the basic and fundamental poses. And I don't teach a full vinyasa, right? They don't know how to do down dog to plank, through chaturanga to upward facing dog, right? So it's my job as the teacher to actually teach them how to do that. Instead, what I normally teach is half of a sun salutation, which is mountain pose, arms reach up, forward fold, half lift, forward fold, reach your arms up, back down to mountain pose. And then I actually teach them how to do a piece of the vinyasa. So in every single one of my beginner yoga classes, I'm either teaching them how to do down dog, how to do down dog to plank, how to do chaturanga, how to do cobra pose, right? So I'm actually in each class breaking down how to do a piece of the vinyasa. I'm not teaching a whole vinyasa. Does that make sense? Because when you don't know how to do a vinyasa, that's a major area for injury, right? If people are just rushing through chaturangas or rushing through upward facing dog, that's a huge potential for your students to get injured. In my yoga sequencing made easy ebook, I do actually list out beginner friendly yoga poses. So if you're interested in that, if you're ever wondering like, is this pose beginner friendly, definitely download my ebook as I list some of them out. So some other distinctions is the pace of your class. In a beginner class, the pace is generally slower, right? We don't want to be moving one breath, one movement. We want to be holding the poses for about 3 to 5 breaths. Another key distinction in beginner is transitions. So a transition you do not want to do in beginner yoga to get to low lunge or standing poses is in downward facing dog, kick your leg through. I'm going to show you. So do not teach this in beginner yoga. This is actually very, very challenging, this transition here. And let me know in the comments why you think this is challenging, right? I'll show you what ends up happening is this, right? And then the students go like this, and then they're frustrated that they can't do it. This is actually a very hard transition. Now think about who is your beginner student. If your beginner student is somebody like me, somebody who works a 9 to 5, someone who sits at a desk, someone who's not very athletic, that's really hard for them. Some of their body parts are getting in the way. It's just challenging. So what I suggest doing instead is doing it from tabletop. Extend the leg behind you, draw the knee to the nose, and step the foot through. From here, you can tuck the toes, extend the leg back, and redrop the knee. Normally, I would have blocks, so give me a second. Let me go grab those. You could even teach that with your hands on blocks like this. You're in your tabletop position. Extend the leg back, knee to nose, see how much more space is created. Step the foot through, tuck the back toes, lift the knee, extend the leg, redrop the knee. You're in your low lunge. So this is a good transition to do in beginner yoga class. Another super beginner friendly transition is starting in mountain pose. Simply take your hands to your hips and step back, right? You can get to all of your standing poses from here. So those are the two transitions to do to keep your classes super beginner friendly. Also keep in mind in a beginner class, your class doesn't have to flow. It's okay to not always have smooth transitions, and it's okay to just say, you can take a seat on the mat now, right? It's okay to be a little choppy in beginner yoga. Some other beginner yoga distinctions are themes of your class for your Dharma talks. So you really want to, in beginner, teach basic yoga terms and basic yoga principles, like what is yoga? What is an intention? How do you set one? What is a drishti? What does namaste mean? How do you get out of your head and drop into your heart? What does Om mean? What is meditation? How do you listen to your body, right? Like take the opportunity in beginner yoga to actually teach them some of the yoga basic concepts. And the use of Sanskrit. So generally, I don't use Sanskrit unless I tell them what it means, because they're not going to know what it means because they're new to yoga. So those are some of the beginner yoga distinctions. Again, you can download that in my free ebook, Yoga Sequencing Made Easy, if you wanted to read along. I also, in my ebook, have a sequencing template for beginners that you can get. I'll verbally go over it with you, but you can download the ebook and use the template. It is super, super helpful. So when you're going to sequence a yoga class for beginners, you first start with the peak pose. So some great peak poses are something like tree, modified eagle, modified hand to big toe pose, modified warrior 3. You list out the 3 key muscles that you need to either strengthen or stretch in order to achieve that peak pose. And then you build your grounding and your tune-in, which is 5 to 7 minutes. It starts by getting your students present, teaching a breathing technique, sharing a Dharma talk, and setting an intention for your class. Then you move into your warm-up, which is about 10 minutes, excuse me. So Your warm-ups are where you move the spine in the 6 directions while also stretching or strengthening one of those key muscles. So something to avoid when teaching beginner is just doing a warm-up in easy seat, something like this, 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 right? Because in easy seat, if you're a beginner, if you sit a lot, if you have lower back pain, sitting like this is really, really hard, right? So how can you warm up the spine in the 6 directions while also opening the hips or opening the shoulders or stretching the hamstrings, right? Give yourself permission to be a little bit more creative, but still within the realms of being beginner friendly. So you want to warm up the spine in the 6 directions while also strengthening and stretching one of those key muscles that you need to get to your peak pose. From there, you move on to tabletop and low lunge poses. This is about 15 minutes, so this is where maybe you do your cat and cow, your puppy's pose. I always teach child's pose in this section. I teach them how to do it. I let them know it's their yoga home pose, that they can come here no matter what, even if I'm not cueing it. And this is in the section. This is the section where you do tabletop, extend the leg back, draw the knee to the nose, and kick the foot through the hands to do some low lunge poses. After I've done my low lunge poses on both sides, I'll teach a piece of the vinyasa. So I'll break the vinyasa down and I'll teach downward facing dog one class. The next class I'll teach downward facing dog to plank. Then I'll teach how to do chaturanga. Then I'll teach how to do low cobra, right? So I always teach a piece of the vinyasa. After that, we'll move into standing poses. And I'll simply use that transition of hands to the hips, step the foot back. I'll do a standing sequence that's about 3 to 5 standing poses on one side. Move into our balancing pose, which is generally my peak pose in beginner. And then we'll move into cool down, which consists of forward folds and back bends. I think I forgot to be giving you the time. So the standing poses is about 10 minutes. Balancing pose is about 5 minutes. The cool down is about 10 minutes. And then we move into shavasana, which is about 3 to 5 minutes. So that is the class template and the structure. Again, it's in the ebook. You can download it, link in the description. One of the most important things when it comes to teaching beginner yoga is teach in a progressive manner. What do I mean by this? Is each pose can really be broken down into variations, and each pose can normally be made easier 3 levels and more challenging by 3 levels. So what you don't want to do is, let's use Warrior 3 as an example. What you wouldn't want to do when you're teaching Warrior 3 is have them reach their arms above their head, extend their leg behind them, and say, if you can't do this, then take your hands to the blocks. This makes students feel defeated, like they can't do the pose, like yoga's not for them, like they're not good enough. It's also not beginner friendly because Warrior 3 is a really hard pose, right? So instead, you're going to teach level 1 of a pose. So that's the easiest variation of the pose. And then you'll give them options of how to know to try level 2 and level 3. So you'll teach level 1 to the whole class. They're all doing it together. You'll say something like, you can stay here, or if you want to challenge your core, try this. You'll teach level 2. You'll then give them an option of how to know when to try level 3. If this feels super easy for you and you want even more of a challenge, try this. And then you teach them level 3. So you see how the whole class is starting with level 1 together, and it's just an invitation to try level 2 and then level 3. So let me give you an example with Warrior 3 of how I might actually teach it in a beginner yoga class. Find your 2 blocks, bring them at the top of your mat. Place your hands on your blocks shoulder distance apart. Walk your feet back about a foot away from your blocks. Bring your feet together to touch. Inhale, your right leg comes back behind you. Point your right toes down towards the ground. Draw your shoulder blades together. Gaze right at the top of your mat. Invitation to stay right here. If you want more of a challenge, maybe your left hand comes to your heart. Place your left hand down. Maybe your right hand comes to your heart. You can stay right here. If you want to challenge your balance, maybe draw both of your palms to press at your heart. So you see how I moved through 3 levels of a pose. This is super, super important in beginner yoga that you're teaching in a progressive manner, and you're only are teaching variations that are appropriate for beginners. Let me know if you have any questions about how to teach in a progressive manner, or if you're unsure of how to teach a certain pose in a progressive manner. Also, let me know that in the comments. One of my biggest tips when it comes to teaching beginners is to create a beginner yoga series. Because in beginner yoga, it's actually a good idea to repeat the same sequences over and over and over again because they need repetition, right? I found at my studio, I created an 8-week beginner yoga curriculum, and I found that they love taking the curriculum 2 to 3 times because they love to be able to watch their progress, right? They loved it when they were able to finally get their shoulders down onto the blocks when they were doing chaturanga. They loved how they could shift their focus from, am I doing the pose right, to actually beginning to focus on their breathing. They loved it when they were able to notice that they were really getting a deeper stretch, right? So in beginners, they do need that repetition because you're teaching them the basics and the fundamentals, and they need repetition to actually learn that. So how to create a beginner yoga series would be create a list of all of the yoga basics and foundational poses and all the basic yoga terms. Pick a length of the series. It could be anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks. Then use the beginner yoga class template that I provide you in my free ebook, Yoga Sequencing Made Easy, to actually create your classes. Make sure to include all of the basic yoga poses and terms, and then repeat the series. So at my studio, we had a weekly, regularly scheduled beginner yoga. I would just repeat this series every 8 weeks. You could also do this series as a one-off beginner yoga series, so the possibilities are completely endless. If you still feel a little bit lost on how to sequence a yoga class for beginners, I actually offer you to steal my 8-week beginner yoga sequence where you can buy it. It's a done-for-you class plan. The link to that is in the description as well. So let me know in the comments if this was helpful and if you have any other questions about how to sequence a yoga class for beginners.